pain wasn't supposed to live in a sanctuary. Ricky knew the scent of his mates, crushed pine, petrichor, and wood smoke. He knew the sterile, biting smell of the clinic, but he didn't know the metallic tang of his own blood blooming against the pillowcase. He screamed, a raw, ugly sound that tore through the quiet ward. When Nurse Abigail sliced open the fabric, steel cascaded out. Needles, hundreds of them, hidden right where the blind Omega rested his head. Darkness was never empty. For Ricky, the absence of sight was a crowded room of temperature shifts, air currents, and suffocating smells. The private recovery ward smelled intensely of bleach, stale ozone from the humming air purifier, and the lingering, heavy pheromones of 3 anxious alphas, Daniel, Finn, and Lorcan, triplets, a terrifying concentration of primal authority that usually made other wolves lower their eyes. To Ricky, they were heavy boots on linoleum, calloused hands that ran too hot, and a chorus of low, rumbling chests. They had left an hour ago to handle a territory dispute, leaving Ricky alone with his exhaustion. His body felt brittle, hollowed out by the strange, lingering fever that had landed him in the clinic 3 days prior. His head rested against a newly changed pillow. It felt stiff, institutional. Ricky shifted, trying to find a hollow in the synthetic feathers. A sharp, microscopic bite stung the base of his skull. He froze. His hand, pale and trembling slightly from the fading fever, reached up. He felt the coarse cotton of the pillowcase, expecting to find the sharp quill of a stray feather. His fingertips found nothing but smooth fabric. He settled back down, exhaling a breath that rattled in his dry throat. Bite. This time, it wasn't a prick. It was a vicious, tearing scrape against the tender skin just above his scent gland. Ricky hissed, jerking away. He miscalculated the edge of the mattress, his shoulder slamming into the cold metal of the bed rail. The pain was immediate, a dull ache radiating down his arm, but it was eclipsed by the sudden wet warmth trickling down his neck. Blood. He knew the smell instantly. Copper and old pennies mixed with the sweet distress spike of his own Omega pheromones. He didn't want to call for help. The clinic staff already treated him like spun glass. Being the blind mate of the regional alphas made him a liability, a fragile object to be handled with exasperating caution. He hated it. He hated the pity in their lowered voices, the way they moved things out of his path with loud, exaggerated announcements. Just a feather, he muttered to himself, his voice sounding thin and unconvincing in the sterile room. He reached behind his neck again. His fingers came away slick. It was more than a drop. Frustration, hot and ugly, bubbled in his chest. He turned his head, intending to shove the offending pillow off the bed entirely. As his weight pressed down on the side of his face, the trap sprung. Agony ripped through his cheek, his ear, the soft curve of his jaw. It wasn't 1 point of pain. It was 12. 2 dozen. Sharp, unyielding steel piercing his skin, sinking into muscle, scraping against cartilage. It felt as though a jaw of iron teeth had clamped down on the side of his head. Ricky didn't mean to scream. He wanted to be stoic. He wanted to pull away, press the call button, and calmly report an issue. Instead, a guttural, terrifying noise ripped itself from his throat. It sounded like an animal caught in a snare. He thrashed, which was the worst thing he could do. The movement drove the hidden metal deeper. He tried to push himself up, but his hand pressed into the center of the pillow for leverage. Fire shot through his palm. More needles. "Help!" He gasped, the word breaking into a sob. He hated himself for the tears that sprang to his sightless eyes, stinging the fresh punctures on his cheek. Somebody. Footsteps, rubber soles squeaking violently against the polished floor. The door swung open, the displacement of air hitting Ricky's face a second before the smell of peppermint and fear washed over him. Nurse Abigail. "Mr. Ricky? Oh my God!" Her voice wasn't calm. It wasn't professional. It was steeped in raw horror. Ricky felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. If she was panicking, it was bad. My face, Ricky choked out, his chest heaving. He held his injured hand close to his chest, curled like a dead spider. The pillow. It bit me. It was a childish thing to say, but his brain was short-circuiting. The pain was a living, breathing entity, throbbing in time with his racing heartbeat. Don't move, Abigail commanded, her voice shaking violently. Do not move an inch, Ricky. He could hear the metallic snip of heavy trauma shears being pulled from her pocket. The bed dipped slightly as she leaned over him. Her hands, clad in latex, hovered near his face. He flinched at the smell of the gloves. I have to cut it, she breathed. I can't pull it away. They're hooked. What is it? Ricky demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous, breathless growl. He wasn't a pup. He deserved to know what was making him bleed. The fabric of the pillowcase yielded with a harsh tearing sound. Abigail snipped again, cutting through the thick ticking of the pillow itself. There was a sound, a soft, sinister cascading noise. Clink, clink, shh, like handfuls of nails being dropped onto a ceramic plate. Needles, Abigail whispered, the word barely audible over the hum of the air purifier. Ricky, your pillow is stuffed with sewing needles. Bile rose in the back of Ricky's throat. Needles, hundreds of them, judging by the sound raining down onto the mattress. Someone had deliberately sliced open his pillow, packed it with sharp steel, and sewn it back up, waiting for him to lay his head down, waiting for him to turn blindly into the trap. Get them out, Ricky snapped, the fear abruptly transmuting into a cold, hard rage. Get them out of me. I'm trying, Abigail said, her breath ghosting over his bloodied cheek. Some of them are barbed. I need to call the doctor. I need to call your mates. No! Ricky grabbed her wrist with his uninjured hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. Pull them out. Now. I'm not letting them walk in here and see me pinned to the bed like a butterfly on a board. It was a matter of pride. A stupid, reckless pride, perhaps, but it was all he had left. The triplets were already suffocatingly protective. If they saw this, if they saw him bleeding from a trap designed specifically for his blindness, he would never breathe fresh air without a chaperone again. I can't, Abigail said, her voice cracking. Ricky, you're bleeding too heavily from the neck. If I pull the wrong one, I could nick an artery. A heavy, terrifying vibration shuddered through the floorboards. It wasn't the hum of the clinic's machinery. It was the synchronized, pounding rhythm of 3 pairs of heavy boots, taking the stairs 2 at a time. The alphas. They had felt his distress through the bond. The clinic doors didn't just open. They were violently thrown back, the hinges shrieking in protest. Instantly, the air in the room became unbreathable. The scent of crushed pine, petrichor, and wood smoke slammed into the confined space, but it was ruined, soured. The pheromones were acrid with panic and a burgeoning, murderous fury. Ricky! Finn's voice broke first. Finn was the youngest by 4 minutes, his energy usually frantic and bright. Now, he sounded like he was choking. Back away from him! Daniel snarled. The command was laced with alpha resonance, a low-frequency rumble that vibrated against Ricky's teeth and forced Abigail to stumble backward, whimpering. Daniel was the eldest, the enforcer. Don't yell at her, Ricky hissed, his hands curling into fists. She didn't do it. Lorcan was there next. Lorcan rarely spoke, moving like a shadow despite his massive frame. He didn't make a sound, but Ricky felt the sudden drop in temperature beside his bed. Lorcan was observing the damage. Needles, Lorcan stated softly. His voice was a calm, dead thing. It was far more terrifying than Daniel's roar. Don't look at me, Ricky muttered, turning his face away, which only caused another spike of pain as a needle shifted in his jaw. He let out an involuntary gasp. Stop moving, little bird, Daniel commanded, though the resonance was gone, replaced by a desperate, rough tenderness. Strong, calloused hands, Lorcan's, judging by the calluses on the thumbs, gently braced Ricky's skull, holding him perfectly still. "Call the surgeon," Finn barked, presumably at the terrified nurse. "Get the head of the clinic in here now. Lock down the building. No one leaves. No one enters." "I'm fine," Ricky lied. His cheek felt wet. His neck throbbed. The palm of his hand was on fire. "You're bleeding from your scent gland," Daniel observed, his voice dark and tight. He leaned in close. Ricky could feel the heat radiating off the alpha's broad chest. Daniel's nose brushed against the uninjured side of Ricky's neck, inhaling deeply. "They targeted your gland. They wanted to ruin your scent." Ricky swallowed hard. The implications crashed over him. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't just cruel. It was an attack on his identity, his biology, his bond with the triplets. An Omega whose scent gland was mutilated could lose the ability to soothe their mates or signal distress. The doctor arrived in a flurry of nervous energy and sanitized hands. The next hour was a humiliating blur of local anesthetics, the sickening slide of metal being pulled from his flesh, and the tight pulling sensation of sutures. Ricky refused to cry. He lay there, his uninjured hand gripping Finn so hard his knuckles ached. Finn let him squeeze, stroking Ricky's knuckles with a trembling thumb. Daniel paced at the foot of the bed, his boots wearing a trench into the linoleum. Lorcan remained completely motionless by Ricky's head, an immovable anchor in the storm of sensory overload. When it was over, Ricky felt thick and sluggish. Half his face was bandaged, his neck wrapped in stiff gauze. His right hand was wrapped up to the wrist. "We're taking him home," Daniel announced to the doctor. It wasn't a request. "Alpha Daniel, he should remain for observation to prevent infection." I said, "We are taking him home. This place is compromised." Daniel's voice left no room for argument. Ricky didn't fight them. He just wanted to leave the smell of his own blood behind. But as Lorcan carefully slid his arms under Ricky's back and knees, lifting him from the bed, Ricky realized the scent of blood was permanently etched into his memory. The sanctuary was gone. The darkness he lived in suddenly felt less like an empty room and more like a cage holding a predator. The drive back to the estate was suffocatingly quiet. The luxury SUV was heavily soundproofed, turning the outside world into a muffled hum. Inside the cabin, the tension was a physical pressure against Ricky's eardrums. He sat in the expansive back seat, sandwiched between Finn and Daniel. Lorcan was driving. Ricky could tell by the precise, aggressive way the vehicle took the corners. Nobody spoke. The triplet scents were a chaotic mess of overprotective pheromones, pine needles crushed under heavy boots, rain turning into a storm, wood smoke suffocating a fire. They were trying to soothe him, blanketing him in their scents. But it was too much. It made Ricky feel small, helpless. "I can breathe, you know," Ricky said quietly, his voice raspy. Finn immediately shifted, pulling back slightly. Sorry, Ro. Are you hurting? Do you need the pain meds?" "I need space," Ricky corrected, staring blankly ahead. Daniel grunted, a low rumble of displeasure. "You need protection. Whoever did this had access to the private ward. They knew the staff rotations. They knew you were blind." "I know I'm blind, Daniel," Ricky snapped, the bitter words tasting like ash. "You don't need to remind me." "He didn't mean it like that," Finn murmured, his hand hovering over Ricky's knee before pulling away, unsure if touch was welcome. "I know how he meant it," Ricky said. He leaned his head back against the leather seat, wincing as a dull ache throbbed beneath the bandages. "Someone thought it would be easy to hurt me because I wouldn't see it coming, and they were right." Silence descended again, heavier this time. Ricky hated the pity. He hated the way they handled him like a cracked teacup. He was an Omega, yes, and he lacked sight, but he wasn't a fragile idiot. He had navigated a brutal world before the triplets claimed him. He had survived. When they arrived at the estate, the protocols changed immediately. The sprawling, centuries-old manor house usually felt airy and open to Ricky. He knew every draft, every creaking floorboard, the scent of lemon oil on the mahogany banisters. Tonight, it felt like a fortress. The heavy iron gates clanged shut with a terrifying finality. Guards, alpha enforcers from the pack, were stationed at every door. Ricky could hear the heavy thud of their boots on the gravel, the metallic click of weapons being checked. Lorcan carried him inside, refusing to let Ricky walk. "Put me down," Ricky demanded, squirming against the massive chest. "No," Lorcan replied simply. His voice was a deep bass that resonated in his sternum. They bypassed the main staircase and took the private elevator up to the Alpha Suite. The suite occupied the entire top floor, a sprawling den of plush carpets, heavy velvet curtains, and the deeply ingrained scents of the triplets. Lorcan set him down gently on the edge of the massive circular bed. The mattress gave way softly beneath him. Ricky immediately stiffened, his hands hovering over the pillows. The memory of the metal tearing his skin flashed hot and vivid in his mind. Finn noticed. He moved quickly, stripping the pillows off the bed entirely and tossing them onto the floor. "No pillows tonight," Finn said, his voice tight. "Just blankets." Ricky exhaled a shaky breath, feeling a pathetic wave of relief. He hated that he was scared of a piece of bedding. "I need a wash," Ricky said, standing up. His legs felt a bit wobbly from the anesthetic, but he locked his knees. "I'll draw the bath," Daniel said, already moving toward the master bathroom. "I can do it myself," Ricky argued, taking a step forward. "Ricky!" Daniel stopped and turned. His scent spiked, dark and authoritative. "Someone tried to mutilate you. You're not leaving our sight. Not tonight." Ricky wanted to scream at them. He wanted to tell them that their hovering was making it worse, that he felt trapped, that the darkness was closing in. But he bit his tongue. He knew their instincts were overriding their logic. Their Omega had been injured, bleeding, and terrified, and they had failed to prevent it. They were punishing themselves just as much as they were smothering him. He allowed Daniel to lead him to the bathroom. He allowed Finn to gently undress him, mindful of the bandages. The warm water of the massive sunken tub felt good on his aching muscles, but he couldn't relax. As he sat in the water, Daniel and Finn washing the dried blood from his hair and uninjured arm, Ricky let his senses expand. He blocked out the overpowering scents of his mates. He ignored the smell of the expensive sandalwood soap. He thought back to the clinic, to the moment before the pain. When he had first settled onto the pillow before the needles pierced his skin, he had smelled something. It had been faint, masked by the bleach and the ozone. He had thought it was just the clinic's industrial laundry detergent, but it wasn't. Ricky closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the edge of the tub. He isolated the memory. It was a sharp chemical tang, bitter almond. And beneath that, something organic, something sour. Fear, sweat. Whoever had planted the needles had been sweating profusely. They had been terrified while doing it. And the bitter almond. That was a specific cleaning solvent used for heavy machinery, not clinic floors. "Someone from the estate," Ricky murmured, the realization chilling the hot water around him. The hands washing his hair stopped. The silence in the bathroom became absolute. "What did you say?" Daniel asked, his voice a dangerous whisper. Ricky sat up, water sloughing off his pale shoulders. "The clinic pillow. It smelled like bitter almond and fear sweat. You use that almond solvent in the estate garages to clean the engine parts of the vintage cars." He felt the shift in the air, the realization dawning on his mates. The threat wasn't a faceless stranger at the clinic. The threat was inside their home. Someone had brought the pillow from the estate, or someone from the estate had accessed his room directly. Lorcan, who had been standing silently in the doorway, finally spoke. "I'll lock down the staff," Lorcan said, the chilling calm returning to his tone. "No one sleeps tonight." Ricky shivered, despite the heat of the bath. The sanctuary hadn't just been breached, it had never been safe at all. He reached up, his uninjured fingers lightly touching the dry edge of his neck bandage. He couldn't see the board, but he was finally starting to understand the pieces. If he wanted to survive in this den, he couldn't rely on the alpha's protection alone. He had to learn how to hunt in the dark. Sleep was a shallow, fractured thing. Ricky spent the night hovering in a miserable state of semi-consciousness, his body rigid beneath the heavy silk sheets. Every time he drifted off, his brain conjured the microscopic scrape of metal against cotton. He would jerk awake, his heart hammering against his ribs, his injured hand throbbing in time with his pulse. By the time the heavy velvet curtains were drawn back, the faint mechanical whir of the automated tracks signaling morning, Ricky was exhausted. He felt gritty. The right side of his face was a stiff, swollen mask of medical tape and gauze. The skin around his jaw pulled uncomfortably when he tried to swallow. "You're awake." Daniel's voice was a low, rough scrape in the quiet room. He hadn't slept either. Ricky could smell the stale, burnt edge of Daniel's pheromones, lacking the usual fresh pine crispness. "Barely," Ricky rasped. He sat up slowly, hating the way his injured hand trembled when he used it to push himself off the mattress. Footsteps approached. Finn. He smelled like strong, bitter coffee and suppressed anxiety. A ceramic mug clinked gently against the wooden nightstand. "I brought coffee," Finn said softly. "Black. The way you like it." "I didn't want the kitchen staff making it, so I did it myself." Ricky reached out, his uninjured left hand finding the warm curve of the mug. He took a sip. It was terrible, burnt and over-extracted, but he drank it anyway. The heat felt good on his raw throat. "Where is Lorcan?" Ricky asked, the caffeine sharpening his clouded mind. "Downstairs," Daniel answered. The mattress dipped as the large alpha sat heavily on the edge of the bed. He confined the entire estate staff to the west wing. 42 people, groundskeepers, maids, mechanics, security. Nobody leaves. Ricky set the mug down. The ceramic rattled slightly against the wood. "You're going to interrogate them. We are going to find out who brought that pillow into your room," Daniel corrected, his tone leaving no room for debate. "And then I am going to break every bone in their hands." Ricky flinched, not from the violence in Daniel's words, but from the sudden suffocating wave of protective alpha pheromones that flooded the room. It was like breathing in thick smoke. It was meant to make him feel safe, but it only made him feel small. "I'm coming down with you," Ricky said. He didn't ask. He stated it. Daniel stiffened. "Absolutely not. You're staying here. You're injured." "I have stitches in my face and a bandaged hand, Daniel. I don't have broken legs." "Mom." Ricky threw the covers off, his bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. A sharp ache shot up his jaw at the sudden movement, but he ignored it. Whoever did this smelled like bitter almond and fear. You can't smell that beneath the stench of your own anger. You need me. "It's too dangerous," Finn interjected, stepping into Ricky's path. "Ro, please, let us handle this. They targeted you. Putting you in a room with all of them is insane. Insane is letting the person who did this watch you stumble around blind while they hide in plain sight." Ricky's voice cracked. He hated the shrill, panicked note that bled into his tone. He took a steadying breath, forcing his voice lower. "I am blind, Finn. I live in a world of smells, sounds, and textures. You alphas smell in broad strokes, territory, aggression, fear. I smell the details. I smell the grease under a mechanic's fingernails. I smell the difference between laundry soap and industrial solvent. Let me do this." Silence stretched between them. Ricky could hear the heavy, measured breathing of the two alphas. He knew what they were doing. They were communicating through the bond, a silent exchange of authority and instinct. Finally, Daniel exhaled a long, frustrated breath. "Fine, but you don't leave my side. And if I tell you to step back, you step back. Understood?" "Understood." Dressing was a humiliating ordeal. Ricky refused help, stubbornly fumbling with the buttons of his shirt one-handed. He chose a dark, heavy sweater that hid his neck, offering a false sense of armor. He felt vulnerable, exposed. The walk down to the grand hall felt like a funeral march. The estate was terrifyingly quiet. The usual sounds of vacuum cleaners, clinking dishes, and muffled chatter were entirely absent. Instead, there was only the oppressive hum of the central heating and the heavy, synchronized footfalls of his mates. Lorcan was waiting at the double doors of the west wing. He didn't say a word as they approached, simply reaching out to rest a massive, heavy hand on the back of Ricky's uninjured neck. It was a grounding gesture, steady and warm. Ricky leaned into it for a fraction of a second before straightening his spine. "They are lined up in the gallery," Lorcan rumbled. "It reeks of panic in there." "Good," Daniel snarled. He pushed the heavy oak doors open. The air in the gallery hit Ricky like a physical wall. It was a chaotic, sour tapestry of terror. 42 people, all sweating, all breathing rapidly. The smell of cheap deodorant, stale tobacco, nervous sweat, and mint chewing gum clashed horribly. Ricky stepped inside, flanked immediately by Daniel and Finn. He could hear the collective intake of breath from the staff as they saw him. They saw the bandages. They saw the grim, murderous expressions of the Triplet alphas. "Line them up against the wall," Ricky said quietly to Daniel. "I need to walk past them." Daniel barked the order. The sound of shuffling feet and nervous whispers filled the room. Ricky waited, his uninjured hand gripping the hem of his sweater to keep it from shaking. He was terrified. The person who had packed a pillow with needles specifically to maim him was standing in this room. They were looking at him right now. "Ready," Finn whispered near his ear. Ricky nodded. He stepped forward. The darkness was no longer an empty room. It was a minefield, and he was walking right into it. Walking the line was a masterclass in sensory overload. Ricky moved slowly, his head tilted slightly to favor his uninjured ear. Daniel walked a half step behind his right shoulder, Finn mirroring him on the left. Lorcan stood at the far end of the gallery, a silent, looming threat that kept the staff frozen in place. Ricky focused on breathing through his mouth, taking in the air over his tongue to catch the heavier scent particles. First person, female. Heart rate elevated but steady, smelled of bleach and lavender. A maid, no bitter almond. Second person, male, shaking slightly, smelled of wet soil and diesel. A groundskeeper. He kept moving. The pain in his jaw throbbed a steady rhythmic ache. The painkillers were wearing off, but he welcomed the clarity it brought. He couldn't afford to be numb. 10 people, 20, nothing. Just an overwhelming tide of general fear and varied body odors. The air was getting thick, suffocating. Ricky felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine. Doubt began to creep in. What if the smell at the clinic had been a coincidence? What if the attacker wasn't here? He paused, swaying slightly. The exhaustion was catching up to him. "Ricky?" Daniel's voice was a low rumble of immediate concern. A hot, calloused hand gripped his elbow. "Enough. You're pale. We're done." "No!" Ricky snapped, yanking his arm away. The sudden movement sent a fresh spike of agony through his cheek. He hissed, swaying again. "Don't be stubborn," Finn pleaded from his left. "You look like you're going to pass out. We'll do this another way. We'll check the security logs. Security logs won't tell you who stood over my bed and watched me bleed." Ricky spat, the anger flaring hot and bright in his chest. "I'm not a child, Finn. Stop treating me like one." His voice echoed loudly in the cavernous gallery. The staff went dead silent. The tension between the blind Omega and the regional alphas was palpable, a raw, ugly thing exposed for everyone to see. Daniel let out a low, warning growl. It wasn't directed at the staff. It was directed at Ricky. It was the sound an alpha made when their authority was challenged in public. Ricky felt the vibration in his bones, but he didn't back down. He turned his bandaged face toward Daniel. "Growl at me all you want, but if you pull me out of here now, I will never forgive you." He didn't wait for a response. He turned back to the line and took another step. 30 people, 35. And then He hit a wall of scent. It was faint, masked heavily by layers of harsh industrial soap and the sharp metallic tang of cheap cologne. But it was there, the astringent, unmistakable chemical bite of bitter almond solvent. Ricky stopped dead. The person standing in front of him was breathing shallowly, rapidly, too rapidly. Ricky took a half step closer, the scent profile sharpened. Bitter almond, yes. But beneath that, motor oil, old leather, and a terror so profound it smelled sour, like spoiled milk. Who are you? Ricky asked. His voice was remarkably steady, though his heart was threatening to break his ribs. The person didn't answer. Ricky heard the squeak of rubber soles shifting on the polished floor. The person was leaning back, trying to put distance between them. I asked you a question, Ricky said louder this time. Thomas, a voice finally stammered. It was a young male, voice cracking. Thomas from the motor pool, sir. So, Ricky closed his eyes beneath the bandages, focusing entirely on the young man's scent. The fear was different from the others. The others were afraid of the alphas. Thomas was afraid of Ricky. Thomas, Ricky repeated softly. He reached out with his uninjured left hand. He didn't want to use violence. He wanted to use something worse. He pressed his palm flat against the center of Thomas's chest. The boy flinched violently but didn't pull away. Daniel's presence behind Ricky guaranteed that. Through his palm, Ricky felt the frantic, rabbit-like hammering of Thomas's heart. But he also pushed his Omega empathy outward. Omegas were natural soothers, designed to calm and heal. But empathy was a two-way street. If you could push calm, you could also pull emotion. You could read it. Ricky concentrated, letting his senses bleed into the boy's panic. He didn't feel malice. He didn't feel the dark, twisted satisfaction of a sadist. He felt trapped. He felt a desperate, choking coercion. You didn't want to do it, Ricky whispered, leaning in so only Thomas could hear him. You were sweating. You were shaking so badly you spilled the solvent on your sleeve before you left the garage. That's why I can still smell it on you. Thomas let out a choked, pathetic sob. His knees buckled slightly, but he caught himself against the wall. Grab him! Daniel roared, the restraint snapping instantly. Before Ricky could protest, Daniel surged forward. The air pressure in the room shifted violently as the massive alpha lunged. Ricky was shoved roughly aside by the displacement of Daniel's body. He stumbled, hitting the floor hard on his knees, jarring his bandaged hand. No! Ricky yelled, scrambling to sit up. He heard the sickening thud of flesh hitting plaster. Thomas screamed, a high, reedy sound of absolute agony. Daniel had him pinned against the wall by the throat. Who paid you? Daniel's voice wasn't a roar anymore. It was a demonic vibrating frequency that made Ricky's teeth ache. Give me a name or I'll tear your head from your shoulders. Daniel, stop, Ricky demanded, struggling to his feet. Finn was there, catching his arm, trying to pull him back. Stay out of this, Ricky, Finn warned, his own scent spiking with aggressive, violent pheromones. The alphas had found their target. Rational thought was gone. They were pure, protective fury. He's terrified, Ricky yelled, fighting against Finn's grip. He's not a mastermind. He was forced. He mutilated our mate. Lorcan's voice boomed from the end of the hall, shaking the very foundations of the estate. Ricky realized with a sickening jolt that they weren't going to interrogate Thomas. They were going to execute him. And if they killed the tool, they would never find the hand that wielded it. The gallery was descending into chaos. Staff members were weeping openly, pressing themselves flat against the walls in a desperate bid to become invisible. Thomas was choking, his heels kicking uselessly against the wainscoting as Daniel suspended him by the windpipe. Drop him! Ricky screamed. It wasn't a request. He pulled back, drawing on the deepest, most primal well of his Omega biology. He didn't try to soothe them. He weaponized his distress. He forced a spike of pure, unadulterated anguish through the mating bond. It felt like tearing open a healed wound. He projected the memory of the needles, the tearing of his skin, the absolute helpless terror of bleeding in the dark. The reaction was instantaneous. Finn dropped his grip on Ricky's arm, staggering backward with a choked gasp, his hands flying to his own face as phantom pain ripped through his jaw. Daniel froze. The murderous resonance cut off abruptly. He dropped Thomas. The young mechanic crumpled to the floor, gasping hungrily for air, coughing violently. Lorcan appeared suddenly between them, his massive chest heaving, his dark eyes wide and unfocused as he fought off the sudden, overwhelming wave of his Omega's projected agony. Ricky stood trembling, his breathing ragged. Pushing that much emotion through the bond had drained him completely. He felt cold, hollowed out. "Don't!" Ricky panted, pointing a trembling, uninjured finger at Daniel. "Don't you ever ignore me again." Daniel looked horrified. His hands, still curled into fists, relaxed slowly. He took a step toward Ricky, his scent shifting violently from rage to desperate apology. "Ricky, Stay back," Ricky commanded. He turned his attention to the crumpled form on the floor. He knelt down slowly, his knees popping in the quiet room. He reached out, his fingers finding the rough denim of Thomas's work jacket. Breathe, Thomas," Ricky said, his voice dropping back to a quiet, level tone. "Just breathe." The boy was weeping hysterically, clutching his bruised throat. "I'm sorry," he wheezed. "I'm so sorry. They made me." "Who made you?" Ricky asked. He kept his hand firmly on the boy's shoulder, acting as a physical shield between the mechanic and the three alphas looming behind him. "I don't know," Thomas sobbed. "I never saw a face. Just messages on an encrypted burner phone." "They left it in my locker." Ricky frowned. "Why you? Why not a maid who had access to the clinic?" Thomas let out a bitter, wet laugh. "Because of my sister. She owes money, bad money. The messages said if I didn't swap the pillow, they would sell her to a fighting ring in the Northern Territories." Ricky felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't petty jealousy from a scorned estate worker. This was organized. It was strategic. "They provided the pillow?" Ricky asked, pushing for details. "Yes," Thomas coughed. "Left it in the trunk of one of the vintage cars I was restoring. Told me the exact time the clinic guard took his smoke break. They knew everything." Ricky rocked back on his heels. They knew the guard rotations. They knew how to bypass the clinic security. They had the resources to threaten a mechanic's family in another territory. This was a strike against the triplets. Ricky wasn't the target. He was the message. "Do you still have the phone?" Daniel asked. His voice was subdued now, tightly controlled. "Yes," Thomas whispered. "In my boot." "Finn," Daniel ordered quietly. Ricky heard the rustle of clothing as Finn crouched down, extracting the device from the terrified boy's boot. "It's locked," Finn muttered a moment later. "Biometric." "Open it, Thomas," Ricky said gently. He guided the boy's hand toward Finn's voice. A small electronic chime echoed in the hall. "Read the last message," Ricky demanded. Finn was silent for a long moment. Ricky could smell the sudden sharp spike of confusion and dread rolling off the younger alpha. "Finn?" Daniel prompted, stepping closer. "It says..." Finn's voice shook slightly. "The little bird bleeds. Phase 2 begins tonight. Leave the west gate unlocked at midnight." The air in the gallery went dead. Ricky felt his heart stutter. Tonight. They weren't finished. The needles were just a distraction, a way to pull the triplets' focus, to make them chaotic and reactive, to make them drag the entire security force into the West Wing to interrogate the staff, leaving the perimeter vulnerable. "Lorcan," Daniel barked, the absolute authority returning, but this time it was coldly tactical. "Get the perimeter guards on comms, now." "Comms are jammed," Lorcan stated a second later, his deep voice devoid of emotion. "Handhelds are dead. The estate's internal network just went down." Ricky felt the floor beneath him vibrate slightly, not from heavy boots, from something heavier. Outside. The deep guttural roar of a high-powered engine revved in the distance, followed instantly by the sharp, concussive crack of heavy ballistics shattering the reinforced glass of the grand hall's upper windows. They had been played. The sanctuary wasn't just breached, it was under siege. Ricky didn't wait for the alphas to move him. He threw himself flat onto the hardwood floor, dragging the terrified mechanic down with him, as the silence of the estate was violently ripped apart by the sound of gunfire. The shadows hadn't just gotten deadlier, they had declared war. Shattered glass rained down like a crystalline storm, the sharp, irregular fragments biting into the hardwood floor. Ricky pressed his face against his forearms, coughing as a thick cloud of pulverized plaster and drywall dust plumed into the air. The smell was suffocating, chalky, dry, and immediately laced with the harsh, sulfurous bite of cordite. Panic erupted. It wasn't a single, cohesive sound, but a jagged symphony of terror. 42 men and women shrieked, scrambled, and collided in the dark as the estate's main power grid violently failed. The heavy, automated shutters that usually sealed the windows ground to a halt halfway down, their motors whining before dying completely. The gallery was plunged into absolute pitch-black chaos. To the Triplet alphas and the terrified staff, the sudden darkness was a crippling blow. To Ricky, the visual world had never existed. His reality didn't rely on light bulbs. "Down! Keep your heads down!" Daniel's voice boomed over the deafening clatter of automatic weapons firing from the tree line. The alpha's resonance was so powerful it physically rattled Ricky's teeth, cutting through the hysteria. A heavy, incredibly warm weight collapsed over Ricky's back. Finn, the youngest triplet, smelled of spiking adrenaline and terrified, possessive aggression. He was using his own body as a biological shield. "I've got him," Finn snarled, though the words were meant for his brothers. "Lorcan, where are they?" "3 vehicles, heavy armor, suppressed rifles," Lorcan shouted back. His voice came from the far right, near the heavy oak doors leading to the main hall. He sounded impossibly calm, an anchor in the storm. "They're using the tree line for cover, moving toward the east terrace." Ricky struggled beneath Finn's weight. The plaster dust was coating his tongue, making it hard to breathe. "Finn, get off me. You're crushing my chest." "Stay flat, Ro," Finn insisted, his grip tightening. "Listen to me," Ricky snapped, slapping his uninjured hand violently against the floorboards. "They shot out the lights. They want you blind. But they can't see in here either, and they have to come inside to finish the job. If we stay pinned in this gallery, it's a slaughterhouse." Another volley of gunfire chewed through the exterior wall. Plaster exploded inward, raining debris over them. Thomas, the mechanic pinned beneath Ricky's other side, let out a high, keening whimper, reeking so sharply of urine and terror that Ricky nearly gagged. "He's right," Daniel called out. His heavy boots crunched over broken glass as he moved rapidly in the dark. Ricky tracked him by the sound. 3 heavy steps, a pause, 2 more steps. Daniel was positioning himself near the shattered windows. "We need to move the staff to the sub-basement bunker, but the corridors are exposed." "Not all of them," Ricky said. He finally shoved hard enough to force Finn to shift his weight. Ricky pushed himself up onto his knees, his bandaged cheek throbbing mercilessly as his pulse pounded in his ears. "The servant passages, the old ones behind the dumbwaiters, they run between the walls, no windows, narrow." "It's pitch black in those tunnels, Ricky," Finn argued, his hands hovering over Ricky's shoulders, desperate to pull him back down. "We won't be able to see our own hands." Ricky let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Welcome to my world, Finn. You don't need eyes, you need me." A beat of silence stretched between the gunfire. It was the hardest thing for an alpha to do, surrender control, especially in a life-or-death scenario, and especially to an Omega. But the triplets weren't stupid. They knew survival outweighed pride. "Lead the way, little bird," Daniel commanded, his voice tight but resolute. Lorcan, Ricky called out, orienting himself toward the deep, steady hum of the largest triplet's presence. Open the panel behind the third tapestry on the north wall. There's a latch right at waist height. It smells like old mothballs and damp brick. He heard Lorcan move instantly. The heavy fabric of the tapestry swished, followed by the metallic clank of an old iron latch disengaging. A rush of cold, stale air spilled into the gallery, carrying the distinct scent of undisturbed dust and subterranean dampness. Got it, Lorcan confirmed. Get the staff moving, Ricky ordered, climbing unsteadily to his feet. His legs felt like lead, the fading painkillers offering zero buffer against the throbbing in his face and hand. Hold on to the person in front of you. Do not let go. Do not speak. The evacuation was agonizingly slow. The staff, blinded by the sudden dark and paralyzed by fear, stumbled toward the secret passage. Ricky stood near the entrance, using his hands to guide them in. He felt trembling shoulders, sweat-slicked arms, and tears wet against his fingers. He smelled every nuance of their panic. He waited until the last of the staff, a sobbing kitchen maid, slipped into the narrow tunnel. Thomas went next, still clutching his bruised throat. In, Finn urged, pushing gently against the small of Ricky's back. Ricky stepped into the passage. The air instantly cooled. The deafening roar of the assault rifles was muffled to a heavy, rhythmic thudding against the estate's exterior walls. I'm at the rear, Daniel announced, his broad shoulders scraping against the narrow stone walls as he squeezed into the passage behind them. He slid the heavy panels shut, sealing them in absolute suffocating darkness. Take my hand, Ricky said to Finn. He felt the massive Alpha's fingers slide over his, their grip tight and trembling. For the first time since they had mated, the dynamic shifted entirely. In the opulent, brightly lit halls of the estate, Ricky was the fragile Omega who needed guiding. Here, in the lightless belly of the manor, the Alphas were effectively helpless. Ricky was the master of the dark. The passage was a tight, winding artery of stone and brick that ran the length of the west wing. It was incredibly narrow. Daniel and Lorcan had to walk sideways in certain sections, their chests scraping against the ancient masonry. Ricky moved with a swift, confident grace that stunned his mates. He didn't hesitate. He didn't stumble. He trailed his fingertips lightly along the left wall, reading the subtle shifts in the mortar and the faint microscopic drafts that whispered through cracks in the foundation. Watch your head. Low beam in 2 steps, Ricky murmured. He heard the synchronized duck of the 3 massive wolves behind him. A second later, a soft whoosh of displaced air confirmed they had cleared the heavy oak joist that Ricky knew hung exactly 5 feet, 10 inches from the floor. How do you know that? Finn breathed, awe cutting through his anxiety. Because I hit my head on it 3 months ago when I was exploring, Ricky replied flatly. You guys were at a pack summit. I got bored. You were wandering the wall voids alone? Daniel's voice growled from the back of the line, a flare of retroactive protective panic spiking his scent. Focus, Daniel, Ricky reprimanded softly. Keep your ears open. They breached the main floor. Ricky had heard it a few seconds prior, the heavy booted footsteps of the infiltrators stomping across the hardwood of the gallery above them. They moved with military precision, short, sharp commands, the metallic clatter of fresh magazines being slammed into rifles. Then came a new scent, seeping down through the floorboards. It wasn't the smell of a rival pack. It wasn't the scent of wolves at all. It was sour, chemical, artificial. They aren't shifters, Ricky whispered, stopping in his tracks. Finn bumped into him from behind, his hands instantly dropping to Ricky's hips to steady him. What? How do you know? They're sweat, Ricky explained, keeping his voice to the barest thread of sound. It lacks the feral undercurrent. No musk, no territorial markers. It smells like synthetic adrenaline and military-grade suppressants. They're human mercenaries. A heavy silence fell over the small group. Humans attacking an alpha estate was practically unheard of. It meant the people pulling the strings were incredibly wealthy, deeply entrenched in the criminal underworld, and ruthless enough to use human cannon fodder against apex predators. "They're sweeping the rooms," Lorcan noted softly, his superior hearing tracking the movements above. "They realize the staff is gone. They're looking for the panic rooms." "The bunker doors reinforced titanium," Daniel muttered. "They won't get through it without heavy explosives." "They don't want the staff," Ricky said, the cold realization settling into his bones. He touched the stiff bandage on his neck. "They wanted to maim me to draw you out. They wanted you angry, distracted, and gathered in one place. They want the alphas dead. The staff are just loose ends." "Let them try," Daniel snarled softly, the murderous resonance vibrating the stones around them. "We keep moving," Ricky insisted. "The passage splits ahead. Left goes to the sub-basement. Right leads up to the ventilation shafts near the armory." "Take the left," Finn said immediately. "We get you and the staff secure in the bunker, then we hunt." Ricky nodded, tracing his fingers along the brick until he felt the sharp corner of the intersection. He turned left. A sharp metallic click echoed down the tunnel. Ricky froze. It wasn't a sound from above, it was a sound from straight ahead. The air shifted violently. The unmistakable scent of gun oil, stale tobacco, and synthetic adrenaline washed over his face. Someone was already in the passage. "Down!" Ricky shrieked, throwing his body backward, slamming into Finn's chest. The narrow corridor lit up with blinding strobe-like flashes. The deafening roar of a suppressed submachine gun filled the tight space, the bullets sparking off the stone walls and chewing into the brick right where Ricky had been standing a fraction of a second before. It was absolute bedlam. The noise in the confined space was physically painful. Ricky clamped his hands over his ears, screaming as the pressure threatened to blow his eardrums. Finn roared, a pure primal sound of unhinged fury. He shoved Ricky flat to the floor, covering him entirely. The Alpha's muscles were locked tight as steel. Daniel and Lorcan pushed past them. There was no room for finesse. It was brutal, close-quarters slaughter. Ricky couldn't see the violence, but he smelled it, the sudden hot burst of arterial blood, the sickening crunch of bone snapping under impossible pressure, the wet, tearing sound of an alpha's claws ripping through tactical Kevlar and flesh. A man screamed, a wet, gurgling sound that was abruptly cut short. Ricky lay pinned under Finn, his uninjured hand gripping the cold stone floor. He was trembling violently. The smell of death was overwhelming, copper, voided bowels, and the sickly sweet tang of ruptured organs. "Whoa, clear," Lorcan's voice rumbled. He sounded out of breath, his vocal cords slick with blood. Finn slowly lifted himself off Ricky. "Are you hit? Ricky, talk to me. Are you hit?" "No," Ricky gasped, coughing on the thick metallic air. "I'm fine. I'm okay." Daniel stepped back over the bodies, his heavy boots squelching horribly against the floor. He reeked of violence. They breached the servant tunnels. They must have blueprints. "If they have blueprints," Ricky reasoned, his voice shaking despite his efforts to control it, "they know where the bunker is." "We can't take him there," Lorcan said, his voice grim. "It's a trap. They're funneling us." "The armory," Finn suggested. "We take the right fork. It's heavily fortified." "Agreed," Daniel grunted. "Ricky, get up. Do not touch the walls here. Keep your hands on Finn's back." Ricky didn't need to be told twice. He didn't want to feel the ruin the triplets had left on the tunnel floor. He grabbed the back of Finn's tactical vest, relying entirely on the Alpha to guide him over the corpses. His boot caught on something soft and yielding. He choked back a sob, forcing himself to keep moving. They doubled back, taking the right fork toward the armory. The journey was agonizingly tense. Every draft of air felt like a threat. Every creak of the old house settling sounded like a boot step. When they finally reached the end of the passage, Ricky felt the heavy cold steel of the armory's secondary access door. "It's biometrically sealed," Lorcan whispered, running his hand over the panel. "Daniel, need your print." Daniel pressed his thumb to the scanner. A low chime sounded, followed by the heavy clunk of deadbolts retracting. They slipped inside, sealing the heavy door behind them. The armory smelled intensely of gun oil, polished steel, and the heavy, dry scent of dehumidifiers. It was a massive room lined with locked cages of weaponry and ammunition. "Check the security feeds," Daniel ordered, moving toward the bank of monitors in the corner. "The internal network is down, but the closed-circuit cameras run on a separate hardline." Finn guided Ricky to a heavy wooden crate in the center of the room. "Sit. Drink this." He pressed a cold bottle of water into Ricky's uninjured hand. Ricky took a shaky sip. His jaw was throbbing with a vicious, relentless tempo. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving him feeling hollow and bruised. "I have eyes on the Grand Hall," Lorcan announced, his fingers flying across a keyboard. 10 hostiles. Heavily armed, they're interrogating someone." Ricky lifted his head. "Who? The staff is in the tunnels." "Not all of them," Daniel said, his voice dropping an octave. "They have Thomas." Ricky's stomach plummeted. The mechanic must have panicked and run the wrong way in the dark, slipping out of the tunnel before they sealed it. "Turn up the audio," Daniel commanded. Static crackled over the armory's speakers, resolving into the sharp, echoing voices in the grand hall. "Told you, I don't know where they went." Thomas was weeping hysterically. "They vanished into the walls." The walls don't swallow alpha wolves, kid," a new voice purred over the speakers. Ricky stiffened. The voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely devoid of empathy. It sounded like expensive silk sliding over broken glass. "Who is that?" Finn growled. "I don't know the voice," Daniel said, "but he's running the show." "Where is the bunker?" the smooth voice asked. There was a sickening thud, followed by a wet cough from Thomas. "I don't know," Thomas shrieked. "Oh, please. You said my sister—" "Your sister is already in a shipping container headed north," the man interrupted lazily. "You served your purpose, Thomas. You got the needles into the Omega's bed. You drew the wolves out of the woods. Now, tell me how to open the vault, or I'll blow your kneecaps off." Ricky felt a cold, hard knot of fury tighten in his chest. This man had ordered his mutilation. He had exploited a terrified mechanic and trafficked a young girl, all to get to the triplets. "I know him," Ricky whispered. The 3 alphas whipped around to look at him. "What?" Daniel demanded. "How? You've never seen him." "I don't need to see him," Ricky said, standing up. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sudden diamond-hard clarity. Listen to the background of the audio, behind the static. Lorcan adjusted the equalizer. The sound of Thomas weeping filled the room, but beneath it, a faint rhythmic click-clack, click-clack. "He's playing with something," Finn noted. "A lighter," Ricky said. "A heavy silver Zippo. He flicks it open and shut when he talks. I heard that sound 3 weeks ago at the Territorial Gala. He was standing near the buffet line. He smelled like expensive gin, bergamot, and—" Ricky closed his eyes, isolating the memory. "And bitter almond." Daniel inhaled sharply. "The solvent." He didn't just give Thomas the solvent to plant the pillow, Ricky realized. He uses a cologne that shares a chemical profile with it. He hides in plain sight. "What's his name?" Daniel's voice was lethal. "Wyatt," Ricky breathed. "Wyatt Kensington, the human liaison for the Northern Trade Syndicate." "Kensington," Lorcan growled, a low, rumbling sound of pure violence. "He came to the estate last month begging for lower shipping tariffs through our territory. We denied him." "Cool. So he decided to wipe out the regional alphas and take the territory by force," Finn finished, racking the slide of a heavy assault rifle. "Let's go cut his throat." "Wait," Ricky said, stepping forward. He reached out, his hand finding the cold barrel of Finn's rifle. "They have 10 heavily armed men in a defensive position. You charge in there, you'll walk into a firing squad." "We are alphas," Daniel snarled. "We don't hide." You don't hide, but you do use strategy, Ricky countered, his voice sharp and commanding. He was done being protected. He was done being the liability. They don't know you're in the armory. They think you're in the bunker. Wyatt wants you to come to him. So we bring him to us, on our terms. How? Lorcan asked, genuine respect lacing his tone. Wyatt relies on his mercenaries, Ricky explained, pacing a short line in front of the monitors. Without them, he's just a human in an expensive suit. We need to separate him from the pack. Ricky turned toward the faint hum of the air ventilation grate near the ceiling. Lorcan, the ventilation shafts run directly over the Grand Hall, right? Yes, Lorcan confirmed. But they're too narrow for us. We can't drop in. You can't, Ricky agreed. But smoke can, and so can sound. A plan, desperate and raw, began to form in Ricky's mind. It required the Alphas to trust him completely. It required him to weaponize his own trauma. 10 minutes later, the estate was eerily quiet again. In the Grand Hall, Wyatt Kensington paced impatiently, the silver lighter clicking rhythmically in his hand. His mercenaries stood in a tight perimeter, their weapons trained on the shadowed corridors. Suddenly, a thick, acrid gray smoke began pouring from the massive overhead vents. It wasn't the smell of a wood fire. It was chemical smoke deployed from the armory's tactical reserves designed to choke and blind. "Masks on!" a mercenary shouted, the sound muffled by the sudden haze. The men fumbled for their tactical rebreathers. The Grand Hall, already dark, became an impenetrable fog. Then the sound started. It wasn't a roar, it wasn't gunfire, it was a scream. A high, raw, agonizing scream of pure, visceral pain. It echoed through the estate's PA system, blaring from every speaker in the hall. It was Ricky's voice, the exact sound he had made when the needles ripped into his face. He had forced himself to recreate it, projecting his terror into the microphone in the armory. The mercenaries, trained for tactical combat, froze. The sound was deeply unsettling, triggering a primal discomfort even in humans. But it did exactly what Ricky intended. It masked the sound of the Alphas. Under the cover of the chemical smoke and the deafening, looping audio of their mate's agony, Daniel, Finn, and Lorcan dropped from the second-floor balcony into the Grand Hall. They didn't use guns. They used claws. The slaughter was fast, silent, and absolute. The mercenaries couldn't see the wolves in the smoke, and they couldn't hear them over the screaming. They were torn apart before they even realized the shadows had teeth. Wyatt Kensington stumbled backward, choking on the smoke, his gun waving blindly in front of him. He backed up until he hit a solid wall, except the wall breathed. A massive hand clamped around Wyatt's throat, lifting him effortlessly off the floor. The lighter slipped from his fingers, clattering uselessly to the ground. The smoke began to clear as the ventilation system kicked into overdrive. Wyatt found himself suspended in the air, staring into the glowing, murderous eyes of Daniel. To his left stood Lorcan, soaked in the blood of Wyatt's men. To his right stood Finn, his chest heaving, his claws extended. But it wasn't the Alphas who terrified Wyatt. It was the figure stepping out from the shadows behind them. Ricky walked slowly, his posture straight, his head held high. The bandages on his face were stark white in the dim emergency lighting. He moved past the bodies without flinching, guided by the scent of bergamot and fear. Ricky stopped inches from Wyatt's dangling legs. He reached out, his uninjured hand finding the lapel of Wyatt's expensive suit. "You missed," Ricky whispered. He didn't yell. He didn't gloat. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a single blood-stained sewing needle. With a swift, brutal upward thrust, Ricky drove the needle deep into the soft tissue right beneath Wyatt's jaw, missing the artery by a fraction of an inch, but hitting the nerve cluster perfectly. Wyatt screamed, a pathetic high-pitched squeal that rivaled the audio recording still playing softly overhead. "Drop him," Ricky commanded. Daniel released his grip. Wyatt crumpled to the floor, gasping and clawing at his neck. Ricky stepped back, leaning slightly into Finn's side. The young alpha immediately wrapped an arm around Ricky's waist, burying his face in Ricky's uninjured neck, inhaling his scent like oxygen. Daniel and Lorcan stepped forward, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle and feral intent around their mate. The sanctuary had been breached. The den had been soaked in blood. But as Ricky listened to the pathetic whimpering of the man who tried to break him, he realized he wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. He was the most dangerous thing in it. Was that revenge sweet enough? Or did Wyatt get off too easy? The blind Omega just proved that in a den of wolves, you don't need eyes to be the apex predator. But with the Northern Trade Syndicate involved, is this war truly over or just beginning? If you loved this intense sensory journey through the dark, smash that like button, share it with your pack, and subscribe for more raw, unfiltered Omegaverse drama. Let me know in the comments. What should the triplets do with Wyatt now?